This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion with ChangeMaker Gregory Russ, the Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the New York City Housing Authority. In part 1, my co-host Joe Pardavia from Forbes Books Radio and I talked about how Greg made the jump from managing 11,000 tenants in Minneapolis to now handling over 400,000 in New York City.
And Greg, if your job wasn't hard enough, less than 7 months after moving to the city, a pandemic breaks out. Take us back to March and tell us what was going on with NYCHA.
Well, I want to acknowledge my general manager, Vito Mastachulo, and my entire senior staff. We, of course, like every other citizen, we really didn't, I don't think in the beginning we understood the full scope and impact of what was happening. And we were meeting on a regular basis. At first, I think by the middle of March, we were doing remote meetings by that time already. I would say that the first thing was, how do we we're reading the guidance, both CDC, New York City Department of Health, and others, and we had to stand up response to that. And one of the first things we did was do the cleaning contracts. And those were the high touch point cleaning and so forth. And as the whole circumstance evolved, we had many people. Our environmental health and safety would be interpreting guidance from everybody from EPA on the effectiveness of a disinfectant to CDC on hand washing. I think we were fortunate in the sense that we were able to move pretty quickly for a large organization. We did emergency procurements. We were mindful of the guidance. We tried to communicate that guidance. At one point, we crossed the 2.3 million mark in terms of communications, and that would include residents, stakeholders, elected officials, staff, all who are impacted, of course. So I think we adapted to the protective gear as that became more and more clear that the masks were truly beneficial. We were aggressive in trying to get material through the supply chain. In the early to mid-March to late March, you were still struggling to find disinfectant in quantity. You were still struggling to get gloves or whatever. That persistence paid off for us, and the ability to get 2 large cleaning contracts, which we then monitored every day. I mean, we heard, the cleaners didn't come. They didn't come. And by April, we had published a schedule. And recently we passed, I think, 3,000 field inspections.
Wow.
Actually,
you must be proud of that, because I'm sure people probably in mid-March were like, Greg, you see, should have taken that New York job. Minneapolis would have been a whole lot easier. So looking back at it now 4 months later, you must be, obviously not just about yourself, but proud about the way your organization has handled this.
I do have to acknowledge the staff. I mean, keep in mind, I'm not there a year yet, and I'm working with people as if we were there 10 years together. And the second thing is, does it mean our buildings look the way they should? No, because one of the things that you realized, if we could do this touch point cleaning, you still have a lobby that really does need the floor stripped and re-waxed. So right. I don't want to overestimate, but the impact was substantial, and we were able to mount that. And we are also able to begin to change the culture for our employees. I mean, our employees at the sites are considered essential. And we, hey, do you have your protective gear? If you don't, we had to address that. We had to change the way we supplied the sites with certain material. The other thing is we had to create a new conversation. If the employee came to a unit, we suspended a lot of the in-unit work because of the proximity issue and the social distancing, but we still had to do some, and we had to create a dialogue where the employee asked questions, but so did the resident. Those are the cultural changes, changing the way we did the morning muster so people are socially distanced, and then validating that that's occurring. These were all done in like 90 days.
Wow.
I think on reflection, all the organizations, the large institutions that had to pivot, we will reflect on that time, because if we could do it for the virus, which is making these demands on us, why couldn't we do it in our daily operations?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lesson there somehow to extract that energy.
Well, and there's a natural way to mobilize when you're in the middle of an epicenter, but there also, it's good that you have the initiative and the drive, in times of urgency. But, how do you now bring that back down to say, okay, times of urgency also are related to the daily, right?
Yeah. Right.
And try to bring that back in a management
Right.
structure. So, you mentioned you've not been here quite a year. What would you say are your three biggest wins?
I think one of the first things we did was we did an internal reorganization, very unglamorous, in an effort to be a better partner with the monitor. We created a new department to work with the monitor. The demands of the agreement that we signed are pretty significant, and we had to organize around that. It took us a little while, and some of this was happening before I got here. I want to be clear about that. We set up a structure, and we've stuck to that structure as a way to meet the requirements of the agreement. And that there's absolutely no visibility to that other than internally. And also, but I think it was important that we do that. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think that we are beginning to use the agreement that we had to sign to point to the future and to indicate to residents that we are not going to be where we are today with certain conditional issues. We're going to make these fundamental changes. And I've talked about those, the reinvestment and the property management. And then I want to say that one of the things that NYCHA had in place before I got here is we had a really strong, after the difficult heating season we had a couple years ago, we revamped the whole thing. The heating action plan was one of the first the monitor approved. And I felt being here that I was able to really build on something solid. And we had a decent heating season. And some folks said, well, it was pretty mild. Okay. And maybe it was. But I think that this notion of that the organization was responsive was a very powerful one. The last thing I'll say is we're strengthening our RAD approach. We focused a lot on the fear part that we talked about. We actually spent time before COVID at one of our properties in a really, really intense working group session with residents and stakeholders. And there was a lot of learning in that for me, especially. I think that maybe that plus having the stability, a little bit of stability with respect to leadership, just having that also. I realize those are not necessarily very glamorous goals to shout out to, but they're functional and we needed that at the time. And now we can begin to think about what are we going to set our sights on for the future.
It's funny talking to Katie over the months working on this podcast, Greg. You notice that the successful people in your line of work care about the tenants. I mean, you can't do this job without caring about people. But the one thing that as a director and as someone who runs these large groups is a lot of these people are just numbers. You don't get to meet a lot of their residents. So how are you able to convey empathy to people that you may never meet and they're just a number on a spreadsheet?
Well, I think one of the things is when I first arrived in New York, I did a lot of family day site visits and got out and met folks. I guess the thing you have to be is you just have to be straight with anything you're telling your residents. If I say we've had a 100% improvement in that particular aspect of how NYCHA does work, but there's a building that we missed, then the person's going to say, well, wait a minute, Mr. Russ, what about my building? And I think in our public institutions, we tend to think of somehow there's a divide. There is a divide between the organization and the folks it's supposed to serve. Part of this job is letting people try to get access to you and you're sharing what you're thinking. It's a conversation. It's not like, oh, hey, here's a guy coming in telling you what to do. It's more like, well, here's some ideas about what we can do. And over time, we have to share this together. When I got to Minneapolis, for example, there were a group of people that just were convinced that we were going to sell all the housing and put people out in the street. They may not believe you all the time. I mean, I get that, but you have to establish some connection that's personal and human. And you are who you are, and you have to show them that. And then the other thing is, these are smart people. I mean, I think one of the things we do when someone is economically disadvantaged is we somehow say, oh, gee, boy, they didn't do this or they didn't do that. Well, okay, it's easy to think about negatives, but the fact is some of the smartest people I've ever worked with are public housing residents. These people know what the hell they're talking about. Not only is it their lived experience, but they see the product. They see whether you are actually delivering what you said you're going to deliver. Did you do the repair on time? And if you didn't, what's the matter with you? It's kind of like when you get a bum product, when you've ordered it online, you say, this is what I got. You send it back. And of course, what has Amazon done? They've adapted to returns and make it, well, there's a similar dynamic. Plus, to your point earlier, these are folks who have made it their point to be informed. They ask questions and they deserve answers. And I think that's part of the misconception about families who live in subsidized units, whether it's public housing or one of the other HUD programs. There are folks in there who really know what they're talking about, using their heads every day. A lot of times they're just using their heads to make sure they can make ends meet, but that doesn't mean that they're not doing really interesting ideas and thoughts in other ways.
Well, it sounds like you are not just leading, but you're also trying to get your agency to be approachable, provide access, be genuine, and then also layer that with results.
Yes.
Right. Because you can't just sit there and say, oh, talk to us, be engaged, and,
Right.
it's one way, but you've got to turn around and make that two-way. Here's the results. Here's where we're proving ourselves. Here's the plan where we're going to get there.
Yeah.
We may not be able to fix all of the elevators today, but here's the plan. Here's the cycle. So has there been anything that has, and I'm sure there has, but I want to know what has surprised you? Has there been anything that's really surprised you when you arrived at NYCHA? And what have any of those challenges or positive surprises or negative really?
Sure. Well, I mentioned in almost every case where I was able to, before COVID, sit and meet with the residents. They had their issues. We're not going to sugarcoat them, which is fine. That was really helpful to have that reception. I have to say, probably one of the things that surprised me was the condition of the units. It's been a while since I've seen some of these conditions in the public housing stock. And in walking these buildings and going into apartments and going into mechanical rooms and penthouses and all the rest of that stuff, if that doesn't light a fire under you, then you're in the wrong business. But I think we have property that looks great. We have property that's in good condition. Don't get me wrong. But the places where the asset begins to fail, that has a significant impact on the quality of the building and the quality of the apartments, and you can't ignore it. The other thing I think that has been, maybe it's not a surprise, but I would welcome it, is the dedication of so many of the NYCHA staff. If you work in a turbulent environment, I mean, you don't have to stay there. NYCHA certainly had its share of turbulence, and yet we have some folks who contribute well past that and continue to do so. I think that's an underrated quality in public service. And I think NYCHA has thousands of people who do that. I wouldn't say that's a surprise so much as it affirms something I've thought for a long time. The other thing I'd say is, we're finally moving towards this, is we had the RAD and NYCHA 2.0 or whatever we're calling it for 62,000 units, but we lacked a plan for the entire portfolio, all 174,000, and we're going to put one of those on the table in the next few weeks. So you can't be timid at this scale. That planning for the other 110 plus the 62, the reorganization, all of those are things we should have done earlier. I mean, I'm not necessarily faulting because there were other issues, but we're getting there now.
The plan for transformation, RAD redevelopment, reinvestment, maintaining, preserving what you have, and responding to a national pandemic epicenter. So you definitely have your hands full here. But, it's doable.
It is doable. I mean, there's many examples of this all over the country. Many of the apartments in Cambridge are the same age as apartments here in New York City, and we were able to revitalize those. Minneapolis stock is a little newer. Chicago, when I was there, we had really similar conditions. Philadelphia, this notion of making the investment in your organizational structure, the asset, and the people, that's a way forward. And when we talk about housing as infrastructure, that's what I think of it as. It's those three things. And I think the first thing you say is, well, it's an infrastructure bill. It's like we're going to build a new highway or build a new apartment. Yeah, that's true. We need the capital to do those things. But capital brings with it, when you have capital in this country, you have the ability to touch these other things in ways that you can't do. So getting those investments to line up, that's part of our job.
Well, thank you for your time, and we wish you the best, and we hope that you get $40 billion in capital improvements.
So do I. So, and we're going to be aggressive about it. But to be honest, I appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation. Thank you. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.